Hi, welcome to our sheet metal tape. In this tape we're going to show you how to replace a complete panel, a section of a panel. We're going to show you how to metal shrink, how to metal finish, and we're going to teach you how to weld. We're not only going to teach you metal welding, steel welding, we're going to teach you aluminum welding. We're going to use a MIG welder when it comes to the steel and a gas welder when it comes to the aluminum. Ray's going to do the teaching.
Okay, before we get to teaching on this welder, we want to talk about safety. First thing you want to protect are your eyes. Even if you have a set of goggles like this with a proper lens to protect your eyes, don't use these when you're welding with an arc welder. The arc rays coming off of this machine can really damage your skin. Use a full face helmet. That way your face is protected.
Ray, tell them about the type of lens that they should have in that.
Yeah, this is a number 10 lens inside this welding helmet here. Next thing you want to do is make sure that you have a long sleeve shirt on. You want to protect your arms from those same arc rays and also from getting burnt with a splatter. Your hands are the closest thing to the torch head. Wear gloves. Never wear short pants when you're welding because the sparks on your legs are going to hurt. And always protect your shoes. Make sure that the hot sparks don't go down into your shoes. Now, the next thing you want to do is make sure that you're not welding with somebody in the family or a pet or someone watching this operation. This is a fascinating thing to watch, and sometimes you'll catch children watching it, and that would be bad. Okay, what we want to do is talk about this little MIG. These are 110 MIGs. They plug into house current. What you want to do also is make sure that when you plug this in, that it's on a circuit by itself. In other words, not with a washing machine or some other appliance that may take the current away from this. This takes all the current it can get out of a house outlet to operate. Another thing you do is make sure that you never use an extension cord that is too light to operate the machine. That's going to cause resistance and the machine isn't going to operate correctly. The machine like this welds steel in two different fashions. It'll weld steel gas or gasless. We have this set up for gas. But what we want to do is talk about the gasless first. When you weld gasless with one of these things, it takes a special wire that's hollow. Inside that wire is a flux. As you weld, that flux melts and creates a gas which protects your weld. Without that gas, you would get an inferior weld. Now, that flux also cools quicker than the metal. It rises to the top, creates a slag, and that also protects the weld. That's good, but the only thing that's bad is when you're using it to do body work, you can't have that slag on your weld. So what we're going to do is we're going to weld with gas. That way, when you pull this trigger, not only does the wire come out, but gas is fed through this hose too, and it comes out of these orifices inside this shield. So every time that you pull the trigger, you'll get a shot of gas and you'll get a shot of the wire. The longer you hold on to the trigger, the more the wire will come. So what we want to do is plug the machine in, turn it on, and let's talk about how it operates. As you can see, when I pull the trigger, the wire just keeps coming. You'll need a side cutters or a wire cutter handy because you'll be cutting a lot of wire off. If you don't pull away from the weld quick enough, you'll have maybe an inch or two. You want to cut that off.
You want that to start with about a ½ inch of wire out, right?
Yeah. You'll cut this at about a ½ inch away from the top of the gun here. And that way, when you're welding, you'll hold the gun about a ½ inch away from what you're welding. That way the gas will shield what you're doing. If you were to hold it far away, the gas would just blow away before it had a chance to shield your weld. So you want to keep the gun at least a ½ inch away from what you're doing. Now, we have some sheet metal here, and Fred always tells me that if you want to learn how to play a piano, you're going to have to practice at it. So what we're going to say here is that you've got to practice at doing this. This is a hobby, and it takes a lot of time to learn this, and a hobbyist has got nothing but time. This is what you enjoy doing. So you want to take your time, and you want to learn how to do this. We're going to talk about the settings on this welder first. It has an off and on switch, of course. And when you turn it off or when you turn it on, make sure you turn your gas on, or you're going to be welding gasless. It has some other switches here. It says maximum and minimum and 1 and 2. What these are is settings for the heat control of the welder. It also has a dial here that dials the speed that the wire will come out of the nozzle. If you turn it up to a 10, the wire is going to come out fast. If you turn it down to a 1 or a 2, it's going to come out real slow. You would use this dial setting when you're welding light or heavy metal. When you're welding light metal like this, it would be best to start this dial setting at about in the middle at about a 7 or a 5. Get it so that just the wire, enough wire comes out to do the job for you. Now, you're going to have to practice with your settings to know what kind of setting it's going to take to do the job on the metal. But what we want to talk about first is the continuous weld. When you're welding continuous, that means that you're going to lay this down, you're going to pull the trigger, and you're going to drag this torch away from your weld. That's what you call a continuous weld. If you weld continuous, you're going to cause an awful lot of heat to go into your metal. So you only want to use a continuous weld in places like down in the floorboards or where you have some good structure. Otherwise, you're going to cause some warpage. We'll talk about that a little while later when we talk about the spot weld aspect. But right now, we want to talk about how you'd hold this torch. The way to do this is to hold the torch steady, make yourself comfortable. Even get a stool I have here, and I'll use that in a minute. But make yourself comfortable. Rest your hand down here and put your torch down where you want the weld to begin. Pull the trigger, lay the torch back about 15 degrees, and pull away as you weld. Try to do it steady. Remember, this is going to take some practice. So let me get a helmet on here.
You know, Ray, you might tell them too that we have taught a dozen different people to do this, and they had no trouble at all, maybe just after a couple of hours practicing.
That's right.
And you might tell them too that their welder that they buy will come with a manual and give all these settings.
Right. But you'll have to practice with it. There's no doubt it's going to take some time.
I'm going to leave you.
Fred will get out of the way because now I'm going to weld. But what we're going to do first is show you what we're talking about on this continuous weld. These MIGs have, of course, this cable. This cable feeds the gas and the wire. Sometimes the cable has to be laid out nice and even, or the wire won't feed properly. So if you find that the wire doesn't feed out of the nozzle real good, it might be because you got the cable kinked. So lay it out so it's not kinked, and set your metal here. Set your torch down on the metal. Lay it back like I said. Pull your helmet down. Okay, that's not a bad weld. That's a continuous weld. What you can see happening here is that I'm actually pulling this metal. That's too much heat. I want to talk a little bit about this ground. Always keep the ground close to where you're welding. Don't hook it on the other side of the automobile. It'll work that way, but it causes the weld to be inferior. Another thing that you're going to find out doing body work, that you're not going to be able to weld, braze, solder, or anything else unless it's clean. So you notice I've got a clean piece of metal here, and I'm going to have clean metal whenever I weld or whenever I solder. Now that's a continuous weld. I want to show you something else here on another kind of a weld. I'm going to show you how to do some spot welds, and we're going to work with different kinds of heats on this machine. You have to learn how to work with the heats because you're going to be working with different kind or different thicknesses of metal. And the only way to know that is to try it with the MIG welder. Try to weld with different heats to know that you have just the right heat to do the job. Now on this side of this thing here, I'm going to do a spot, and I've got the welder set on its lowest setting. Okay, now over here I'm going to do a weld on the highest setting. Okay, now what we want to do is take a look at these two different welds. The one done on the low setting, as you can see, is mounted kind of high on this side. The one done with a high weld, or the high heat, is really flattened out. Let's take a look at the other side. The low heat has just barely penetrated through the bottom of the metal here. And as you can see, when I've used a lot of heat, it really came through the bottom of the steel. That weld, or that wire, was actually shoved right through that steel and it mounted up on the bottom here. What you're doing there is you're going to have to determine how thick the metal is and how much heat you need on your welding machine. You don't want to have too much or too little. Okay, now we want to show you how to join two pieces together. And you'll notice that when you join a couple of pieces of metal together, it's all right if you got the same thickness. But if you have two different thicknesses of metal, then you got a little bit of a different story. What you have to do then, let's say if this side over here was thinner than this side, you would have to direct more heat to this heavier metal in order to weld the two together without burning through the lighter metal. But let's give this a try and see if we can join these two pieces. Okay, now that doesn't look too hard, except that if one of these was lighter than the other, you would have to direct a little bit more of your heat to the thicker side. You know, when you buy this from body shops or wherever you get this metal, you can get anywhere from an 18 gauge to a 22 gauge piece of metal, depending on what they work with. Now I want to show you another kind of a weld. When you're putting panels on bodies such as the support panels on the underside of the floor, and you don't want to show a lot of weld around the edge of the metal where you join this piece to another. The nice way to do it is to drill a hole through this piece of steel, and this is what we call a plug weld. When you put the two together, you weld down through the hole, and you actually do a little weld down in that hole, and you join the two together. Now that's a good way to do a job when you don't want to show all the telltale signs of a weld. If you plug weld it, take your die grinder and cut that plug off of there, you'll never know it's there. Now I want to show you something about making a heavier weld. If you're welding heavy steel, and this machine here will weld up to 1/8 of an inch steel, and that's really heavier than that old Dodge frame that we were working with. The way you want to do it is, suppose you're putting two pieces of steel together, and this is 1/8 inch stuff. If you weld this like this, your weld's going to be mound up on the top, and if you ever want to finish it off, you're going to cut most of the strength of your weld off. So the way to do that is to that's wrong. The way to do that is to bevel your metal, like so, and bevel the other piece, like this. Now when you do your weld, most of the strength of your weld is going to be down into this area here where it should be, and it'll penetrate down in here. That way if you come across with a grinder and cut the top of that off, you're not cutting the strength of your weld away. Now, when you're welding heavy stuff with this MIG, or with any MIG, you're going to have to turn the wire feed up. You want to dump as much wire into that puddle as you can, and you're going to need a lot of it when you're welding heavy stuff. And the same thing goes for welding light stuff. When you're welding light metal, you want to turn the wire feed back so that you don't dump a lot of metal or a lot of wire into your puddle. But when you're welding heavy stuff, turn the heat up, turn the wire feed up, and then make sure that you always bevel it when you cut heavy stuff. For aluminum welding, we're going to use this torch. You people that aren't familiar with one of these, the settings on these are not real critical, but generally you keep your acetylene at about 5 pounds. This will show a little bit more, but when I turn on the torch, it's going to come down to about 5 pounds. The oxygen is usually at about 20 pounds. These are real nice little outfits. You can carry them around. We're going to use the light torch just the same as if it was a propane. The aluminum welding rod we're going to use is this Duroflex. This is bought in a package, and you get more here than you really need for a long time. The other tools we're going to use is a stainless steel wire brush. Without this, you can't do aluminum welding. Whatever you weld, and you heard me talk about it before, has to be perfectly clean. And that goes more so on this aluminum. We have to clean up this spot real clean, and we have to weld it before the oxidation sets in. It's the oxidation that this won't weld over. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some weld right here on this joint to strengthen it up. This is an aluminum door off a 1952 Jaguar. This is our welding rod, and we're going to clean this spot. That's a special brush. When it's a stainless steel brush, is the only thing you can use on an aluminum door. You can't use a regular brush, a regular wire brush. Now we use a torch just like we would use propane. It doesn't take a whole lot of heat to do this. Now you won't see this move. If you were to put a lot of heat on this door, the aluminum would just fall away. It would just crumble and fall. So what we're going to do is we're going to heat the panel, because the panel is going to melt the rod. The rod will only melt after the panel is hot enough. And you don't want to get too much heat, because like I say, it'll fall apart. When you weld with something besides a torch like this, you'd have to use a pair of cobalt glasses. I think we've got it coming along here pretty good. This is actually just melting right into to the aluminum alongside of it. And it just takes a little practice, because you have to know when to start putting this rod on that weld. Now that should be a good strong weld. Normally you could take and bend it. If you could get these two pieces to where you could bend them, the aluminum would break before that weld would break. So it really does a good job binding it up. If you're going to weld with your MIG welder, if it's set up to do aluminum, which most of them are, that machine is there, then it takes a different kind of a bottle of gas. It takes pure argon. It takes, of course, an aluminum wire, and it takes some different settings in the machine. You'll have to read the manual to see how you do that. But then you would have to weld with glasses, like a cobalt glass, so you can actually see what's happening to this aluminum before it happens. Otherwise, it'll just disappear on you. Okay, here's a tip. Get some soft drink cans and practice on them. Wire brush the area real good. If you can weld this stuff, you'll be all right. Just takes a little bit of playing around with. It'd help if you have them a little bit more secure than I got them. It's awful hot. They have to cool. That stuff is still running. But if you play around with them, just tinker around a little bit with this, you'd be surprised. You can weld just about anything with this aluminum.